Hi everyone, good afternoon from Berkeley, California. My name is Ren Cooper from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and I'm a nuclear physicist that specialises in radiation detection. What I'm going to do in this short video is tell you a little bit about the inverse square law and how we can use our knowledge of it to help us detect and locate gamma ray sources in the environment. What I thought I would do is start by saying a little bit about my career path and how I ended up out here in California, and then move on to talk about some physics. So if this is all working, you should be able to see my video here and some slides somewhere here on the right. So I live in the San Francisco Bay Area now, but I'm originally from Liverpool. I went to school at Days High School in McGull, where I got A-levels in physics, chemistry and maths, and from there I then went to the University of Liverpool to do a degree in physics. After that degree, I did a master's in something called radiometrics, which is basically the study of the detection of radiation. And during that course, I was exposed to a lot of the real world applications of radiation and radiation detection. And that kind of inspired me to then go on and do a PhD in nuclear physics at the University of Liverpool. During that PhD research, I did research into radiation detection and specifically gamma ray imaging. I was looking at the applicability of a novel type of radiation detector to small animal medical imaging. After my PhD, I was a researcher at the University of Liverpool for about 12 months, and then I moved to the US for a job at Oak Ridge National Lab, which is just outside Knoxville in Tennessee. There I was something called a postdoctoral research associate, or informally a postdoc. Now, a postdoc is kind of the first job or the first series of jobs that you have at a lab or a university after you finish your PhD. And as a postdoc, I was conducting research into radiation detection for neutrino physics. So I was part of a large collaboration that was building a large experiment to search for a very rare type of radioactive decay called neutrinoless double beta decay. I spent about 3 years at Oak Ridge. And then in 2011, I moved to the San Francisco Bay Area for a job at a different national lab, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, which is where I am now. So at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, I'm a staff scientist. I'm also the deputy head of the Applied Nuclear Physics program in the Nuclear Science Division. And I still conduct research into gamma ray detection and gamma ray imaging. And I lead various projects that are all related to the development of new concepts and technologies for radiation detection. Some of the work that we do involves the development of detectors and electronics and software for fundamental physics. So things like the things that I used to do for neutrino detection when I was in Oak Ridge. But a lot of our work is actually focused on developing systems for use in the real world. So for things like nuclear security and environmental monitoring, amongst other applications. And that's actually what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about an example of how we can directly use our knowledge of the inverse square law to help us detect and track radioactive sources in complex environments like cities. So let's talk a little bit about the inverse square law. The inverse square law is an incredibly important concept in gamma ray detection. And as you're learning, it tells us that the intensity of a gamma ray source decreases with the square of the distance from the source. And if we look at this diagram on the right of your screen, you can see why that is. It's because the gamma rays emitted from a source spread out over a greater area as the distance from the source increases. So you can see that these fixed number of gamma rays are spread over larger surface areas as the distance from that source gets larger. From a practical perspective, the importance of the inverse square law, or the 1/r squared effect, as it's sometimes known, is that even a small change in distance can result in a really significant change in count rate from a source. This image here on the bottom right, for example, shows graphically how the count rate from a gamma ray source falls away really quickly as the distance between the source and the detector increases. So this shows the relative count rate, or the relative intensity from the source. On the x-axis here is the distance between the source and the detector. So you can see that there's this very sharp decrease, this very sharp drop-off in count rate with distance. And the shape of that and the rate at which that drops off is governed here by the squared term in the denominator. What's also important from a practical perspective is that the inverse square law governs what we expect to observe when a radiation detector and a source are moving relative to one another. And that's a relatively common thing to encounter in real world radiation detection. So let's consider a real-world radiation detection problem like that. Let's assume that a gamma ray source has been lost or it's been stolen. And we want to use a gamma ray detector to monitor traffic to try to find that source. This picture shows an example of such a scenario. It shows someone here operating a radiation detector, and along comes a car that is in fact carrying a source. So the car is moving from left to right here through our scene. These lines represent how the distance between the source and the detector changes with time as the car passes by. So at each time step, the length of this line is essentially our R value. What we see is that the distance decreases as the car approaches. It reaches a minimum here in the center when the car, and therefore the source, is directly opposite our radiation detector. And then it increases again as the car drives away. The inverse square law tells us that the count rate in the detector will therefore increase. It will then reach a maximum at this midpoint, and then it will decrease. And of course it does. The count rate that we would see in our detector over the course of a measurement like that would look something like this. And if we knew the speed of the car and we knew the distance of the detector, we could use the inverse square law to predict this curve really pretty accurately. So let's remember that. Let's remember that we can use the motion of the car and the inverse square law to calculate what we expect our detector to see. And let's call this calculation or this prediction a 1/r² model. So in the real world, it's pretty unlikely to find a nice simple scenario with one car traveling in a straight line like we have here. We're much more likely to have lots of cars, maybe some pedestrians, maybe people on bikes. They may be moving in different directions. So all in all, we have a very complicated and cluttered scene. And what we want to be able to do is to say which of those cars in that cluttered scene is carrying the lost or stolen source. And it turns out that we can do that, and we can do it pretty well. And we can do it because we know the inverse square law. The first step, however, is to track every vehicle so that we can calculate the distance between the vehicles and our radiation detector. We can do that using video, and we can also do that using LIDAR. And LIDAR is a type of laser scanner that you see on autonomous vehicles, so self-driving cars and things like that, and Google Street View cars when you see those moving around, mapping the environment. Once we have those tracks that we can extract from the video or the LIDAR, we can then use them to calculate a 1/r² model for each vehicle that we observe. So essentially we use those tracks, we use the 1/r² law, and we ask, what would my detector see if that car was carrying a source? So we can build a 1/r² model for every object, and we can detect the presence of a source. We can then see which of those models agrees with the data from our detector. Whichever one agrees is then likely to be the vehicle that's carrying the source. So let's look at an example of that in action. On the left here is a system that we used for a recent set of tests. This is a lamppost for scale. This is a relatively large radiation detector. Up here is a sensor package that we built for object tracking. So it contains some cameras, it contains a LIDAR. There's a computer in here for real-time processing of all the data from these sensors and from the radiation detector. And there's a battery down here to keep everything powered. So what I'm going to show you is an example of some results from an experiment that we conducted with various cars and pedestrians. One of the cars, which was a white Audi, was carrying a radioactive source. And the purpose of the experiment was to determine whether or not we could correctly identify that that white car was carrying the source. So here are some results. And there's a lot going on here, there's a lot to digest, so let me walk you through it. This top row, this shows snapshots from the 4 cameras in the sensor system, which cover a 360-degree field of view. So these colored boxes, they show objects that are being detected in real time. So there's a person here, and there's also various cars that are being detected. The boxes are colored according to whether or not our system thinks that the object is carrying a source. So the red box shows that we correctly identify the white car as the one which is carrying the source. This image on the bottom left here, this is a top-down view of the 3D map that's produced by the LIDAR scanner. And this shows a top-down view of the 3D tracks of each object through the scene. So you can see some tracks here of different cars, these tracks in green. You can also see the track of the white car, and that track here is shown in red. And again, we correctly identified that that car is carrying the source. This image on the bottom right here, this is really showing how everything works. So this is a plot of count rate versus time. These colored lines show the 1/r² models that we compute for every object that we detect. The black line here, that shows the data that we measure with our detector. So this brown line, this is showing the 1/r² model for vehicle 57, which is the silver Volkswagen here. So this 1/r² model is a very poor fit to the data. So that means that we exclude that vehicle. We say that vehicle can't be carrying the source. This curve in red here shows the 1/r² model for vehicle 48. That's this black Mazda. And that's a better fit to the data than the model for vehicle 57, but overall it's still not good, so we exclude that vehicle as well. This purple line shows the 1/r² model for vehicle 50. So that is the white Audi. And this is a very good fit to the data. So that allows us to identify that that vehicle is likely to be the one that is carrying the source. And of course, as we know, that's correct. So this is actually a really cool new capability. We're about to publish a paper on this, and so in some ways you're getting a bit of a sneak preview of that publication. And it's a very powerful approach to the detection, localization, and tracking of radioactive sources in complex real-world environments. What I think is really cool about it, though, is that although there's some quite advanced things going on in terms of sensing and computing, it fundamentally boils down to using the inverse square law to our advantage. And that's testament to the fact that the inverse square law is really one of the most important concepts and most powerful concepts in gamma ray detection. Today, I've shown you one example of how it impacts radiation detection in the real world, but in reality, there are many, many more, and it's really part of my day-to-day job. The last thing I'll say is that as you continue your physics education, you'll find that the inverse square law crops up all over the place, from electromagnetism to gravity. So what you learn here in the context of nuclear radiation is actually a very fundamental concept of fields and particles. So I hope you found this interesting. I hope that it gives you a sense of how the physics principles that you're learning are important outside the classroom. If you have any questions, I think there's going to be some way for you to submit them, and I'll be more than happy to answer them for you. Otherwise, that's it from me. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your nuclear physics masterclass. Goodbye.